In order to protest against the German government, a group of Munich college students, Sophie and Hans Scholl, Alexander Schmorl, Christopher Probst, William Graf, and George Wittenstein, as well as a professor, Kurt Huber, founded an anti-Nazi organization called the White Rose in the early 1940s during World War II. The assembly wrote 6 leaflets that brought the sins of the Nazi regime to light while encouraging their fellow Germans to think outside the regime's propaganda. Their organization, and eventually all of Germany, felt the responsibility to analyze evil, stand on principle, and assert such principle. Though this protest resulted in execution for most of the members, it established a moral conduct for the Germans of non-violent protest and emphasized the right to hold opinions. The influence of the White Rose is still highly appreciated in Germany, the UK, Sweden, the Soviet Union, and the United States, and they have become a symbol of courage, integrity, and hope.
Before the White Rose group had formed, the Gestapo had full access to phone calls, mail, and search warrants in anyone's person for no apparent reason. There were no open political conversations between friends, since people never knew if their friends were spies and would betray them by turning them into the Gestapo if they opposed the regime. Over 300 groups firmly disagreed with the Nazi regime, but the groups were so small that it was impossible to establish a large group by getting together. Hitler had complete domination over Germany, including education, news, arms, police, and judiciary systems. His party, the National Socialist Party, created the People's Court as a way to eliminate Hitler's enemies. There was even a Hitler Youth group where children were brainwashed with Hitler's propaganda at a young age to support him. Streets were guarded by spies, and citizens were ordered to turn against their family members if they opposed the regime.
The primary leaders of the group, Hans and Sophie Scholl, were not anti-Nazi their entire lives. Alexander Schmorl, however, had always been anti-Nazi, but the Scholl siblings at first believed in Hitler's views and were part of the Hitler Youth, though their father disapproved. Their family was Christian, and eventually Hans and Sophie came to turn their backs against the regime's views and sympathize with their father after they saw the evil and demeaning treatment of their Jewish friends. They came to realize that it is the duty of the citizens to analyze evil in the regime, even if it's during a war, and to especially stop genocide. Hans attempted to reverse the opinions of the Hitler Youth, but ended up excommunicated from the group and was sent to court. Most members of the soon-to-be White Rose were enrolled at the University of Munich. George Wittenstein and Schmorl met at an army service for medics in 1938 and discovered that they had similar political views. By 1939, when the war started and students were required to attend classes in uniform, Wittenstein introduced Hans Scholl and Schmorl at the University of Munich, where Hans created an intellectual group for the medical students to discuss literature, philosophy, art, and music, and they even invited professors. The group was influenced by the Bundische Jugend, which were youth organizations that encouraged romantic ideals but were not majorly influenced by ideas outside of Germany. The group bonded into deep friendships through common interests other than medicine, and though the members were initially hesitant to discuss openly about politics, the regime became more and more oppressive, and they recognized the need to take action against it.
Hans Scholl and Alex Schmorl wrote the first 4 leaflets opposing the Nazi regime in the early summer of 1942. Calling these the leaflets of the White Rose, they pointed out the crimes of the Nazi regime, such as the dictation of German citizens and the cruel treatment and massacre of Jews. Some things they wrote were, "Nothing is more unworthy of a civilized people than to allow themselves to be ruled without resistance by a ruling clique that is irresponsible and given over to dark impulses. If the German people are already so corrupted that they give up the most precious thing that a human being possesses, free will, then they deserve to perish. And offer passive resistance. Prevent this atheistic war machine from continuing to run its course before it's too late, before the last cities are a pile of rubble, and before the last youth of the people have bled to death." They also wrote, "Every word that comes out of Hitler's mouth is a lie. Hitler cannot win the war, only prolong it, and Hitler and his regime must fall so that Germany can survive." The members encouraged their fellow Germans to resist also and make as many copies as possible and distribute them. The leaflets were left in telephone boxes, mailed to other students and professors, and transported to other regions of Germany. Though 35 of the first 100 leaflets were turned into the Gestapo, the rest arrived to their original destinations all over Germany and even to Austria. During this time, Sophie Scholl enrolled into the university and learned of the White Rose and became one of the primary members. Christopher Probst, a friend of Hans and Sophie Scholl, joined the group but could not help write any of the leaflets because of his transfer to the University of Innsbruck. When the university then sent the medical students to Russia for medical care experiences and assistance, William Graf, another medical student, became friends with Hans and Alex Schmorl and joined the White Rose after they returned to Munich. After the group witnessed the treatment of the Russians, they realized that the only way Germany could be saved was by losing the war, which disappointed them because of their love for their country.
When the students returned to Germany, there were many bombings, and the students felt the effects of war more strongly than before, which increased their morale to voice their opposition against the regime. Kurt Huber, a professor at the University of Munich for philosophy, psychology, and musicology, joined the White Rose campaign during this time. In early February of 1943, they decided to paint huge graffiti all around Munich and the university. Some of the things they wrote were "Down with Hitler" and "Freedom."
The fall of Stalingrad in later February of 1943 inspired Huber to write the 5th and 6th leaflets. The group accepted them and sent them out between February 16th and 18th, naming them the leaflets of the resistance movement of Germany. The Nazi officials were enraged by the call for freedom and disobedience, but the rebellion continued to spread throughout Germany. The most crucial point of the organization was when Hans and Sophie Scholl came to the university with a large suitcase full of leaflets on February 18th, 1943. They stacked the leaflets in hallways before classes were dismissed, and dumped the remaining leaflets in the courtyard from the rooftop. Although they almost got away with this, the janitor caught them, locking all the doors of the building, and turned them into the Gestapo. Christopher Probst was also arrested because a leaflet he wrote was found in Hans's pocket.
On February 22, 1943, Munich held a people's court session after the 4-hour trial. The judge didn't quite understand how the members came to turn their backs against the regime because of their formal support. But he was surprised when Sophie remarked, "Somebody, after all, had to make a start. What we wrote and said is also believed by many others. They just don't dare to express themselves as we did. You know that war is lost. Why don't you have the courage to face it?" Hans and Sophie Scholl and Christopher Probst were convicted of high treason and were sentenced to death. The Scholls were granted a last reunion of the family before their execution, and Hans, Sophie, and Christopher Probst were also granted a last meeting together before they were led to the guillotine. In the evening of their executions, student leaders of the university called for a rally to show support for the Nazi regime and dissociated themselves from the White Rose. A second trial convicted Schmorl, Huber, and Graf on April 19, 1943. Schmorl and Huber were executed on July 13, 1944, and Graf was executed on October 12th. George Wittenstein was the only member of the core group who survived, after being proven that he was not guilty for attempting to help a Jew out of Germany. Even though the White Rose was formally ended, it was still affecting people everywhere. Families of the members were arrested by the Nazi practice of guilt by relation. The German press had already written off the White Rose and its members as traitors, but this group was praised around the world in hopes of encouraging another resistance movement to take down Germany from the inside. The Royal Air Force dropped millions of copies of the last leaflet in Berlin in the autumn of 1943. A young couple, Hans Leipelt and Marie-Louise Hahn, made some copies of the 6th leaflet and titled it, "And Yet Their Spirit Lives On." Leipelt was killed, but he was able to save his girlfriend. She was given 12 years in prison. Radio programs in Europe, mostly Britain and America, featured information on the White Rose to bolster hope and confidence. All these things after the executions caused Germans to think more independently about their government and to challenge common thought. In 1943, after the war had ended, the White Rose was publicly commemorated and the former Nazis were able to go back to normal life or make it to the U.S. without persecution for their actions during the war.
The bravery of the White Rose also had a lasting influence on our world today. Each year, on February 22nd, which is the near date of the first 3 executions, there is a public commemoration of the White Rose across Germany. Today, many buildings and institutions are named after the White Rose, especially the Scholl siblings. They exercised the right of freedom of speech and press, most importantly, the right to hold their own opinions without fear of repression. They also set a precedent of a right to fair, unbiased trial. The White Rose emphasized the importance of thinking individually, not just solely depending on others' ideas, or adopting others' ideas without forethought. The members of the campaign were persistent in standing on principle against what they perceived as an evil government, regardless of how many contrary opinions there were, and even to the point of death. They also set an example of their strong love for their country by attempting to bring the government's evils to light and help their country change, and they believed it is the citizens' responsibility to work to preserve freedom and justice in the country.